do it, but they didn't embalm bodies, and so the decaying bodies would become extremely odorous. And so putting these aromatic spices was kind of designed to keep that from happening quite so badly. And they come across and they see this young man clothed in a long white robe sitting on the right side, and they're alarmed, and he says to them, "Do not be alarmed." Literally, stop being afraid. "You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here." He is risen. Simple word in Greek. Egerthe. And what Mark does, it's not quite really clear in English. He uses one word for crucified, one word for raised. They're both right next to each other, and he juxtaposes these two particular words. So it's clear. He was crucified, he has been raised. Both of them, I find interesting, are in the passive voice. Passive voice means it was done to him. It's not something he did. Men crucified him, and so it said he was crucified. God raised him, and so it said he has been raised. Or he is raised, literally. I like to characterize it this way. Men hung him on a cross, made sure he died, buried him, and God said, "Oh, no, you don't," and raised him. I get goosebumps every time I think about that. But that's what these two words say. He was crucified, he has been raised. God said, "Oh, no, you don't." Now, a lot of people assume that really Jesus didn't die, because we know dead people don't come back to life. That's not something that is a part of our experience. But there are reasons to believe that, in fact, he did die. In fact, the evidence that people try to adduce to explain why it is that when the tomb is closed on Friday evening, it's got a body in it. When people approach it on Sunday morning, the body's gone. They try to explain this empty tomb, and they come up with all kinds of far-fetched explanations. They say, well, maybe the body was stolen by the disciples. As a matter of fact, that's the excuse the Jews gave almost immediately. Matthew chapter 28. The Jews told the guards, "You tell everybody the disciples came, stole the body. We'll make sure you don't get in trouble." Because you see, Roman guards would be executed if they were given charge to make sure nobody stole that body out of that tomb, and in fact somebody did. The oldest explanation for the tomb: the disciples stole the body. Well, could that be true? Suppose it's possible. Matthew tells us that there was a Roman guard set around the tomb. He says that not only was the stone rolled in front of it, but Pilate's seal was placed over it so that it would have to be shown that it was tampered with. But, okay, hypothetically, the disciples got past the guard, they got past the seal, they opened the tomb up, they got Jesus out. Can you imagine rolling that huge stone and not waking up the guards? I mean, how many of you folks felt that earthquake the other night? All right? That's what you'd be feeling if you were asleep and you were a guard there. But the real problem is this. Then how do you explain that all of the apostles except John died horrible deaths as martyrs? How do you explain that? Having their heads cut off, being crucified upside down, as we're told about Peter. Even John, thrown in boiling oil, he survived that, and then comes back to live out till his probably 90s. No, you know what? C.S. Lewis put it this way: hypocrites and martyrs are not made of the same stuff. And if these disciples thought it was a good idea to take the body of Jesus and hide it and pretend he'd been raised from the dead, when they didn't believe he was going to be raised from the dead anyway, and if they were to do something like that, as soon as somebody showed up with a sword about to chop their head off, one of them is going to come clean. I can tell you, in my courtroom, somebody always comes clean. It just happens. Or Some people say, well, maybe the enemies stole the body. The Jews did. They were afraid the disciples were going to steal the body, and so the Jews themselves stole the body. Well, okay. First question is, why would they want the body of Jesus in the first place? It's locked up in a sealed tomb with Roman guards. I don't know why they'd want it, but suppose they did. Maybe that's a possibility. Then how can you explain the growth of the church? On Pentecost, when 3,000 people respond to the gospel, well, maybe the Jews aren't prepared for it at that point. But certainly by the time you get to Acts chapter 4, and you got people just coming to Christ in droves, why wouldn't these authorities produce the body and say, here's your Messiah? If they had it, they would have done that. Some people say, well, maybe these ladies went to the wrong tomb. Okay, maybe so. Doesn't make sense. They followed the procession to the burial place on Friday, so they knew where the tomb was. Not only that, but they're not the only ones who went to the tomb. When they go kill the disciples, we read in the Gospel of John that Peter and John run to the tomb, and Peter runs into the tomb. And we see others that come to the tomb after that. Besides that, it's Joseph's private tomb. Don't you think he knows where his grave is? That doesn't make sense. That everybody went to the wrong tomb? Or maybe Jesus wasn't really dead. You know, this is called the swoon theory. He passed out. They thought he was dead. They took him down. They buried him. He revived in the nice, cool climate of that cave. And so when he revived, he got up, rolled the stone back. Oops, can't do that. You can't roll it back from the inside. Okay, so somebody let him out. Okay, how do you explain that he lived after a Roman soldier jabbed a spear into his heart? No, Jesus was really dead. Somebody says, maybe the body was devoured by animals. Okay, how did they get past the Roman guard? How did they get the stone rolled back? How did they get to the body? There is no explanation except the tomb was empty. If the tomb was not empty, when Peter stood up on Pentecost and he preached that Jesus had been raised from the dead, don't you think there would be at least one skeptic in that audience who would go out to the gravesite to see if the tomb was empty or occupied? Just one skeptic, that's all it would take. How many crowds have you seen that didn't have at least one skeptic? And when he comes back and says, no, I just went out to the tomb, the stone's still there, the body's still in it. You can't explain the existence of Christianity, because the fundamental fact on which Christianity is based is the resurrection from the dead. There's an empty tomb, and in over 2,000 years, nobody's come up with a good explanation for it. So I guess we're left, what was it Sherlock Holmes said? When all the impossibilities have been, when all the improbabilities have been eliminated, the only thing that's left is the impossible. He is raised from the dead. He is risen. He is not here. The third truth is Jesus lives. That's what I was hinting at a minute ago when I talked about 1 Corinthians 15. He died. It's done. He was buried. It's done. Since the third day, he has been raised. Paul shifts into the perfect tense. That's not because it's the best tense there is. It's just, that's the term for the tense that describes something that happened at a point of time that results in a condition that continues. He died is written in a kind of a point of action tense. It's called the aorist. He died. Done. He was buried. Done. Then he switches to the perfect tense, and what that means is, since the third day he has been raised. He was raised and is still alive. That's the point. That's the point of Mark 16, verse 8. Then they went out and ran from the tomb, and terror and bewilderment had seized them. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. The end. That's the end of the Gospel of Mark. You say, wait a minute. What about Mark 16:16? What about Mark 16, verses 9 to 20? A couple of nights ago, Mary and I were watching a show. The movie, The Revenant. Have you seen it? It's a very disturbing movie, very graphic. And at the end of it, I said to Mary, don't you hate it when they don't tie up all of the loose ends, when they just kind of leave you hanging in a movie? Don't you hate that? And you're left wondering, okay, does he survive or is he dying? What's really happening here, right? And I see that a lot of times with movies. A lot of times you'll see it with something that has a cliffhanger because they want you to watch the next episode, right? But what I really hate is the ones that don't leave you with a cliffhanger waiting for next week, but they just stop, and that's the end of the story. And you have to fill in the rest of it. That's what happened with Mark 16, verses 9 through 20. Because those verses use a totally different vocabulary, a totally different style of writing than anything else in the Gospel of Mark. It's pretty clear that what happens is Mark stopped his Gospel with Mark 16, verse 8, and somebody says, no, you can't stop there. There's got to be more. And so they put more stuff that they got from the other Gospels and from traditions and things like that. Somebody says, oh my goodness, that means we can't use Mark 16:16. He who believes and is baptized shall be saved, but whoever does not believe shall be condemned. Oh my goodness. I'd rather be consistent with what the scriptures are than what I think they ought to be. Besides, there are a lot of other verses on baptism. The end. Mark 16, verse 8. The Gospel of Mark ends in an open-ended fashion. And I think the reason Mark stops there is to leave us with the enduring question, what will you do with Jesus? We have seen dozens of people following Jesus for all kinds of reasons over the last few months. Mark is left leaving a question in our minds. What will you do with Jesus? You're going to reject him? That's what the Jews did. Or are you going to embrace him? That's what Mark hopes you'll do. But the one thing you can't do is just ignore him and it goes away. At some point, we all have to make a choice. What will you do with Jesus? And that's the reason Mark ends the gospel right there. It's quite clear that the women who were terrified and ran from the tomb, they got over it. The rest of the Gospels tell us that they went to the disciples. They told the disciples about Jesus being raised. The disciples came, checked it out for themselves. The disciples got together. They had a few resurrection appearances of Jesus. And then, starting on Pentecost, the gospel spreads from Jerusalem, goes through Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. They got over it. At some point, though, they had to decide, what are they going to do with Jesus? Reject him, embrace him, because they couldn't ignore him. What about you? What about me? We're going to sing a song. We're not going to stand, I hear. But we're going to sing a song. If you need to make a decision about Jesus, do it now. One of the elders will be in the back at the middle school classroom to talk to you. I'll be at the front. If there's some way we can help you in your relationship to God, take care of it now, because he won't go away. Let's all join in singing.